to another episode of Recently Read. This week I'll be reviewing Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafisi. So Nafisi is an Iranian-born writer and professor. She was a professor at various universities in Tehran, in Iran, and then she moved to the United States in the 1990s, where she became a professor of English literature. English literature is her specialty. It's what she taught in Tehran. It's also much of her focus as a professor here in this state. So the book is essentially a memoir that takes place around the time of the Iranian Revolution. Nafisi writes about her time first in the U.S., where she came to study. She actually studied first in Switzerland as a child, and then she came to the U.S. to study at the college level. She received her bachelor's, her master's, and her PhD here in the U.S. from the University of Oklahoma. And then she returned back to Iran in the sometime just after the overthrow of the Shah. So this book details a lot of her time in Iran as a professor, as a teacher, during the time immediately after the Iran Revolution. Much of the action, if you will, takes place while the Iran-Iraq war is taking place in the early 80s. It also takes place at the time when the Ayatollah Khomeini was in charge of Iran. So mostly the 80s. The story centers around a book club that she starts in the wake of her actually quitting her job as a professor in the 90s. She starts a book club that lasts for a couple of years, where she invites a number of her absolute best students. These students are all female, they're all women, and they're all living during a period of time in Iran in which essentially Iran was under Sharia law. This was a pretty extreme interpretation of Islamic law. Maybe not quite as extreme as Afghanistan, where women are just not permitted to show their eyes or their faces, where they're not permitted to get an education or to hold jobs. Iran, in comparison to Afghanistan, in many ways is far more liberal in the sense that women can get an education, they can hold jobs, but there's a great deal of limitation to their movement and their freedoms. This book club is centered around a certain number of books that they were reading, and the memoir is sort of uses this as a framework. So there are three main authors and three main books that provide the framework around Reading Lolita in Tehran. The first one is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. So this covers the first third of the book, and this is where we're introduced to Azar Nafisi herself, and also her experiences growing up in Iran and Oklahoma, as well as some biographical detail about her. It also introduces the characters or the women who make up this book club or this course that Professor Nafisi holds in her apartment in Tehran. The middle section is The Great Gatsby. This section switches more towards the recent past. So much more of it is focused on events in Iran around the Iran-Iraq war, which I've already mentioned, as well as the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and also the shift from what was a more sort of westernized liberal society into one that is far more religiously and gender repressive. Much of this is built around the idea of anti-imperialism. This was part of what drove the revolution, was sort of ousting Western influence from Iran, and the Shah, the king of Iran, in the 70s was sort of propped up by American influence. And the third part of the book is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It's Actually, the third part is Austen, as in Jane Austen. But the main book that is covered is Pride and Prejudice. During this period of the book, we sort of return back to the present time being the late 90s, and what's going on with Azar Nafisi specifically, as well as her students. This is the portion of the book in which Nafisi begins to contemplate leaving Iran and going elsewhere. As well as some of her students also begin to contemplate this, and a few of them actually do leave. And so this is the main framework around the book. So this book came out in the early aughts. It came out in the wake of 9/11. And it's a book that I've been interested in reading for quite a long time. I remember seeing it on book stands and bookshelves and thinking, oh, that's a really interesting book. I didn't really know anything about Iran whatsoever. All I knew, that's not 100% true. I had grown up in the wake of the revolution myself and was actually very aware of the Ayatollah Khomeini. I was also aware as a younger person regarding the fatwa that the Ayatollah put against Salman Rushdie because of what Salman Rushdie wrote in his book, The Satanic Verses, which have elements that are very critical of Islam. And so I was aware of this fatwa. Essentially, this was a call to kill Salman Rushdie. If you were a Muslim, you were compelled to kill this man who had said these really terrible things about Islam. So I was sort of vaguely aware of Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini and some of the things that were going on there, but really it was something I didn't really know very much about. Like many Westerners, I only knew what was sort of being fed to me by the news at the time, which was not very positive. So I didn't read the book at that time. I actually took a really long time before reading this book. Part of it was influenced by my own travels in the Middle East, and sort of meeting people there and getting to know what life was like today in some ways in certain parts of the Middle East, and getting some context, as well as my studies at the University of Leiden, where my focus was on Western Asia. Granted, my focus is more the ancient world, not the modern world. But still, I became very interested in the region, and through my work, my archaeological work, it meant that I was traveling in that region and doing archaeological work. One of the issues with archaeological work is that you're not really looking at the modern world. Of course, you're looking at the ancient world or the world of the distant past. Definitely, that's the case with myself. But when you're there, you're oftentimes the people you're around a lot of fellow scholars and archaeologists, but oftentimes you're also around people who are from there. Oftentimes a lot of the workmen that work in the field with you are from that region. And so you sort of interact with them, and a lot of your preconceived notions begin to sort of melt away. You see something very different. And that's certainly been the case with me. And so after spending some time working in that region and then also studying it for my graduate study, I decided that this would be an interesting book to revisit. And so what I liked about it was that it kind of gave me more context. It sort of discusses some of the political events that were taking place at the time, but also the sort of very personal events, specifically surrounding the experience of women. Azar Nafisi has very specific experiences as a woman, a highly educated woman in Iran, and what she sort of went through. She was a person who returned to Iran as a young adult to be a professor, to be a teacher, to be an educator, and then found that there were a lot of roadblocks for her to be able to do that. But also her students and what they had to go through. And this is a little bit different because whereas Nafisi is older, she grew up in the 60s and 70s. She's in her 70s right now as of this recording. Her students are in their teens, their 20s. As the story progresses into the 90s, some of them are certainly in their 30s and 40s. but most of them didn't really live through what she lived through, especially as a person who came from a more liberal family. And so it kind of gives you a lot of personal experiences, anecdotal experiences. And I think this is something that is often missing when we read articles or see the news about the region, about Iran or Afghanistan. This is specifically Iran, of course, or Iraq or Jordan or Turkey or any of these other countries that are in Western Asia. What I didn't like is that in some cases, because this is a memoir, memoirs, I think, tend to be less factual. Now, the difference between a memoir and an autobiography is actually really important. Memoirs focus in on a very specific period of time, and it doesn't sort of encompass a person's entire experience throughout their life, whereas an autobiography is meant to do exactly that. Memoirs also tend to be a little bit more focused on emotional impact of events that are taking place. And this is something that I sort of struggled with because I wanted more specific detail. I felt sometimes that she was talking about her emotional response to something rather than a real factual thing. Or she might say something to the effect of, oh, I tried to travel during this time, but I wasn't allowed out of the country. And I'm thinking, while I'm reading this, well, what were you traveling for specifically? I'm interested in that. This is important. Were you traveling for a conference? Were you traveling for vacation? It's sort of left unclear. What matters is the emotional impact, which I think is very interesting, but also feels like there's something missing. Another thing is very early in the book, she states very clearly that she's changed the names of the people in the book. Perfectly reasonable, but she also changes certain character, certain aspects of their character for the reason that she doesn't want people to be able to go back and sort of pick at who these people are, almost like if they're doing it for gossip. I think this is a bit troublesome because I found that there were moments when I was reading the book where she would be speaking about a particular individual, and I'm thinking, well, is this person real? Or is this just sort of made up? And if that's the case, can we really say this is nonfiction? Is it really more like autofiction? Is it more something like what maybe someone like Karl Ove Knausgaard does, which is that he writes about certain events in his life, but in a fictional way? And sometimes the specifics of the dialogue feel really precise, and I'm thinking there's no way this could be true, and there's no way this person can be true. But then again, the idea is that she's sort of creating a more sort of generalized story around her experience and around the experiences of these people. So that's something that I struggle with, but I also understand the reasoning. But I certainly learned a lot. I learned specifically about the experiences, of course, of women during this time, and what they could and couldn't do, and their sort of day-to-day experience, from personal relationships, from relationships with boyfriends and husbands. I learned a lot about the fact that women could and still can get an education in Iran. They can go to university. However, the education that they receive is highly filtered. It's filtered through basically it's sensorial. There's certain words you're not allowed to use. There's certain things you're not allowed to talk about, like sexual experiences or even things as simple as drinking wine. And so that was something that I found really fascinating, that I learned that is really hard to get. Again, really difficult to get when you're reading news articles or watching the news. So overall, I have to say that even though I have some issues with the book, as I mentioned, it's still really actually a great book. And so I definitely highly recommend it. I would say I would put this in actually required reading. If you're a person who's learning about the modern Middle East or Western Asia, from the direct experience of people, I would say this is absolutely required reading. It's a great book from which you can learn what the day-to-day life of women were in Iran during this time. And it does cover quite a long period of time from essentially the 80s, 70s, 80s into the 90s. So it's very, that's 30 years of experience that you get to learn about. So absolutely required reading for this subject. And so this is a book that I believe that you should read. So thanks again. Join us again next week for another episode of Recently Read, and thanks for watching.